In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, where silk whispered secrets and eunuchs knew everything, a scandal brewed behind velvet curtains, one so boringly forbidden, it could lull even the most curious sultan to sleep. Tonight, we tiptoe through the harem's moonlit corridors, where sultanas flirted with danger, lovers hid behind embroidery, and every sigh was scented with rosewater and regret. So fluff your pillow, dim the lantern, and prepare for a tale of love, lust, and lullabies, because nothing says bedtime like historical gossip wrapped in velvet. And hey, before you drift off into dreamland, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments from which corner of the empire you're watching. Istanbul, London, the back of your couch. I'm listening, very sleepily, in the deepest folds of Topkapi Palace, past the courtyards where peacocks strutted like they owned the place, and beyond the fountains that burbled with suspiciously poetic timing, lay the harem, a labyrinth of velvet whispers and really confusing hallway layouts. The harem wasn't just a place, it was a mood, a vibe, a scented maze of intrigue, where every cushion had heard a secret and every curtain had seen too much. Here, the sultanas reigned. Not officially, of course. The empire had rules, and those rules involved men with turbans and scrolls. But unofficially, these women ran the show. They were queens of the quiet coup, empresses of the eyebrow raise, and duchesses of the dramatic sigh, and they were bored. You see, being a sultana wasn't all rose, petals and poetry. It was mostly embroidery, passive-aggressive tea parties, and pretending not to notice when someone's bracelet mysteriously vanished during a game of backgammon. So what did a powerful, clever, and slightly sleepy sultana do when palace life got dull? She found a secret lover. Not always on purpose, mind you. Sometimes it was a passing glance at the falconer. Sometimes it was a shared joke with the calligraphy tutor. Sometimes it was just the gardener complimenting her tulips a little too enthusiastically. And thus began the velvet labyrinth, a tangled tale of forbidden flings, coded embroidery, and love letters disguised as shopping lists. But don't worry, it's all very boring, perfect for bedtime. So snuggle in, let the scent of jasmine lull you, let the sound of distant oud music soothe you, and let the secrets of the sultanas drift over you like a silk veil in a gentle breeze. Hurrem Sultan was not your average palace resident. She had flaming red hair, a mind sharper than the sultan's sword, and a talent for turning embroidery into espionage. She could recite Persian poetry, plot political maneuvers, and still find time to look effortlessly bored during royal banquets. But even empresses get lonely. One evening, while brushing her hair, with a comb carved from ivory and sass, she noticed something odd. The bristles were slightly loose. Being the suspicious sort, and also mildly bored, she tugged at them. Out popped a tiny scroll, rolled tighter than a janissary's bun. It was a love note. Written in miniature Ottoman script, the message read, "Your beauty blinds me more than the midday sun. Also, I think you dropped your bracelet in the courtyard." Romantic and helpful. Classic Semil. Semil was a court musician with a lute, a limp, and a habit of composing songs about fruit. He had once serenaded a fig, but his true passion was Hurrem, or at least the idea of her, since they'd only exchanged 3 words and 1 awkward nod. Their affair was brief. It consisted of 1 stolen glance, 1 shared pomegranate, and a moment in the bathhouse where they both pretended not to recognize each other. Then, as all good palace romances do, it ended. Shamil was reassigned to the Janissary marching band, where he spent his days playing drums and wondering if Hurrem ever thought about that fig. Hurrem, meanwhile, moved on. She had empires to influence, sons to raise, and a new hairbrush. This one with no secret compartments. But sometimes, late at night, she'd hum a tune about fruit and smile. In the harem of Topkapi Palace, where secrets were folded into silk and gossip floated like rose-scented steam, there lived a man who knew everything and said almost nothing. His name was Hassan the Whisperer. Hassan wasn't born into whispers. He earned them, slowly, strategically, one overheard sigh at a time. His ears were legendary, not for their size, but for their precision. He could hear a sandal squeak 3 courtyards away and identify the owner by the rhythm of their walk. He once decoded a scandal from the way a sultana stirred her tea, counterclockwise, with a flick of the wrist. That meant betrayal, obviously. Hassan had no official title beyond head eunuch of the 3rd corridor, but unofficially, he was the palace's librarian of secrets. If you wanted to know who was sneaking into whose chamber, who was hiding love letters in the hem of a caftan, or who was pretending to faint just to get a peek at the palace physician, Hassan had the answer. He didn't speak it, of course. He'd simply raise an eyebrow, sip his sherbet, and let you stew in your own curiosity. One spring evening, as the jasmine bloomed with suspicious enthusiasm, Hassan stumbled upon a particularly juicy affair. Sultana Melike, known for her embroidery and her ability to win arguments without speaking, had taken a liking to Yusuf, the palace gardener. Yusuf was a man of soil and sonnets. He grew cucumbers that made the kitchen staff weep with joy and wrote poetry that made the sultanas weep with confusion. Their romance was coded in produce. Melike would send requests to the garden. 2 cucumbers and a handful of mint, which translated to, "Meet me by the fountain at midnight." Yusuf would reply with, "The roses are blooming early," which meant, "I'll bring the pomegranate." It was a system so elaborate, it made espionage look like a board game. Hassan, naturally, decoded all of it. He kept a journal, not of names, but of vegetables. It was safer that way. One entry read, "Cucumber, cause rendezvous. Mint, cause urgency. Pomegranate, affection. Eggplant, confusion. Carrot, miscommunication. Radish, heartbreak." The affair lasted 3 weeks. 2 baskets of fruit and 1 near discovery when Melike accidentally sent a carrot instead of a cucumber. Yusuf showed up at the wrong fountain. Melike waited in the wrong garden. Hassan watched from a balcony, sipping sherbet and shaking his head like a disappointed librarian. Eventually, the romance wilted like overwatered basil. Melike moved on to a falconer with strong arms and weak poetry. Yusuf focused on his zucchinis. Hassan added turnip, rebound, to his journal. And the harem, it kept whispering, because in Topkapi Palace, love was fleeting, vegetables were cryptic, and Hassan the Whisperer was always listening. Kosem Sultan was not a woman to be trifled with. She had ruled the empire from behind the veil, orchestrated political alliances with the flick of a fan, and once convinced a vizier to resign using nothing but a raised eyebrow and a well-timed yawn. But even empresses of intrigue have soft spots. Kosem's calligraphy, she adored the art of letters. the swoop of a well-formed alif, the curl of a gain, the way a sentence could dance across parchment like a belly dancer with a secret. Her chambers were filled with scrolls, inkpots, and pens carved from sandalwood. She collected scripts the way other women collected jewelry. Enter Idris. Idris was the palace calligraphy tutor. He had ink-stained fingers, a voice like warm honey, and a habit of quoting Rumi at inappropriate moments. He was supposed to teach the young princes how to write imperial decrees. Instead, he found himself teaching Kosum how to write love poems in invisible ink. Their lessons began innocently enough. Kosum wanted to master the Diwani script, the most elaborate, most dramatic, and most likely to cause hand cramps. Idris was patient. He guided her hand, corrected her strokes, and occasionally complimented her choice of metaphors. But then came the ligatures. Ligatures, in calligraphy, are the romantic entanglements of letters. They cling to each other, curve around one another, and whisper sweet nothings in ink. Kosum became obsessed. She started writing entire verses where the letters practically cuddled. Idris noticed and responded. He began slipping coded messages into her practice sheets. One day, beneath a perfectly executed Kosum, found a faint line written in lemon juice. Your words linger longer than my breath. She held the parchment over a candle. The message glowed. Her heart fluttered. Or maybe that was just the heat. Their affair was quiet, poetic, and deeply impractical. They met in the scriptorium, surrounded by scrolls and silence. Kosum would pretend to critique Idris's penmanship while secretly memorizing his smile. Idris would pretend to correct her ligatures while secretly admiring her wit. They never kissed. They never touched. But their words danced. Until one day, Kosum wrote a verse so beautiful, so haunting, that Idris wept. He left the palace the next morning, claiming he had to find the source of the ink that made her soul speak. Kosum never saw him again. She kept the verse, framed it, hung it above her writing desk, and every time she wrote a decree, she paused, just for a moment, to remember the man who taught her that letters could love. In the harem, diplomacy wasn't conducted with scrolls or swords. It was conducted with pillows, not the soft, innocent kind you find in a guest room. No, these were embroidered weapons of passive aggression, stuffed with goose feathers and centuries of unresolved tension. They were wielded by sultanas, like royal declarations, flung across divans with the precision of seasoned warriors, and at the center of the most infamous pillow skirmish in palace history stood Sultana Aishi. Aishi was known for her beauty, her biting wit, and her ability to nap through political crises. She had perfected the art of the strategic snooze, falling asleep just as a rival began to speak, waking up only to deliver a devastating one-liner, then drifting off again with a smirk. But Aishi had a problem. Her favorite pillow, the one embroidered with golden tulips and lined with lavender sachets, had gone missing. She suspected foul play. Her rival, Sultana Fatma, had recently acquired a new pillow. It looked suspiciously familiar. Same tulips, same lavender, same smug aura. Aishi didn't confront Fatma directly. That would be uncouth. Instead, she launched a campaign of sleepy sabotage. First, she began hosting accidental naps in Fatma's favorite lounge. She'd arrive early, drape herself dramatically across the cushions, and snore just loud enough to disrupt conversation. Then came the embroidered insults. Aishi commissioned a new pillow, crimson silk, silver thread, with the phrase, "Some of us done to need to steal comfort," stitched across the front. She carried it everywhere, to tea, to poetry readings, to the bathhouse. Fatma pretended not to notice. Everyone else noticed. The tension escalated. Fatma retaliated with her own pillow. Real queens rest easy. It was subtle. It was shady. It was war. Soon, the harem was divided. Team Aishi napped in the east wing. Team Fatma lounged in the west. The eunuchs were caught in the middle, delivering pillows like peace treaties and dodging flying feathers. And then, as all great palace dramas do, it ended with a nap. One afternoon, Aishi and Fatma found themselves alone in the scriptorium. The sun was warm. The cushions were plentiful. They looked at each other. They looked at the pillows. And they fell asleep, side by side, snoring in harmony, their pillows touching like truce flags. When they woke, the feud was forgotten. The harem returned to normal. The pillow war was over, but the legend remained. To this day, in the quiet corners of Topkapi Palace, you can still hear whispers of Aishi's embroidered shade and Fatma's retaliatory fluff. And if you listen closely, you might just hear the soft, sleepy sound of diplomacy in goose feathers in the palace gardens of Topkapi, where fountains whispered and roses plotted among themselves. There bloomed a scandal so fragrant it nearly perfumed the entire empire. It began with tulips. Not just any tulips. These were the rarest, most delicate, most absurdly dramatic tulips ever cultivated. Their petals curled like calligraphy. Their colors shifted with the mood of the sky. And their scent was rumored to cause mild romantic hallucinations. The man behind these botanical wonders was Yusuf the gardener. Yusuf was a quiet soul, with dirt under his nails and poetry in his heart. He spoke to plants more than people, and his tulips responded with loyalty, beauty, and occasional sass. He was known to hum lullabies to his lilies and recite verses to his vines. The palace staff found him odd. The sultanas found him intriguing, especially Sultana Nazlı. Nazlı was a woman of taste. She appreciated fine fabrics, rare spices, and men who didn't talk too much. One morning, while strolling through the garden in search of inspiration for her embroidery, she stumbled upon Yusuf tending to a bed of tulips that looked like they had been painted by angels with a flair for drama. She complimented the flowers. Yusuf blushed. She asked about their care. Yusuf stammered. She reached out to touch a petal. Yusuf dropped his watering can. It was love, or at least a very intense mutual appreciation of horticulture. Their affair blossomed slowly, like a shy daffodil. Nazlı began requesting bouquets with suspicious specificity. 3 crimson tulips, 2 white, and one that looks like it's judging me. Yusuf delivered them, with notes tucked beneath the stems. Verses about longing, petals, and the agony of forbidden affection. They met in the greenhouse, under the guise of botanical consultation. Nazlı would pretend to inspect the soil, while Yusuf recited poetry so quietly, the orchids blushed. They never touched, they never kissed, but their hearts bloomed. Then came the tulip scandal. One day, Nazlı wore a tulip in her hair, a rare variety that only bloomed in Yusuf's private plot. The palace noticed. Whispers spread. The tulip was traced. The gardener was summoned. Yusuf, ever poetic, confessed nothing. He simply said, "The tulip chose her." Nazlı said nothing. She simply smiled. The Sultan, amused and mildly confused, reassigned Yusuf to the citrus grove. Nazla took up citrus embroidery. Their affair ended, but the tulips remained, blooming defiantly, fragrantly, and with just a hint of scandal. The palace bathhouse was a place of steam, serenity, and scandal, built with marble so smooth it could lull a vizier into a nap, and fountains that burbled like they were gossiping in code. The bathhouse was where sultanas went to relax, reflect, and occasionally plot the downfall of their rivals while exfoliating. But for Sultana Elif, it was also where she fell in love. Elif was known for her grace, her intelligence, and her ability to make even a simple towel look like a royal decree. She had a laugh that echoed like poetry, and a gaze that could silence a room faster than a dropped tray of baklava. Her secret admirer? The palace masseur, Rafiq. Rafiq was a man of few words and many oils. He had hands that could soothe a sultan's stress, and a smile that made the steam seem warmer. He was quiet, respectful, and entirely off limits, which, of course, made him irresistible. Their first encounter was innocent. Elif had requested a massage after a particularly exhausting embroidery session. The thread had tangled, the pattern was crooked, and someone had spilled rosewater on the silk. Rafiq entered, bowed, and began his work. But something shifted. As his hands moved across her shoulders, Elif felt something more than relaxation. She felt curiosity, intrigue, a flutter that had nothing to do with steam. She began requesting massages more often, always at dusk, always in the same chamber, where the light filtered through stained glass and painted the steam in shades of scandal. They spoke little, a few words about pressure points, a comment on the temperature, but their silences were heavy with meaning. Then came the rendezvous. One evening, Elif left a note beneath a folded towel. It read, "The jasmine blooms at midnight, so does my heart." Rafiq found it. He read it. He didn't reply. But that night, he was there. They met in the bathhouse, alone. The steam wrapped around them like a secret. They didn't touch. They didn't kiss. They simply sat, side by side, letting the silence speak. It was the most romantic moment Elif had ever known. And it was the last. The next morning, Rafiq was gone, transferred to a distant palace. No explanation, no farewell. Elif never asked why. She simply returned to the bathhouse, alone, and let the steam carry her memories. She never left another note, but sometimes she'd whisper to the jasmine-scented air, "Midnight still blooms," and the bathhouse, ever loyal, kept her secret in the outer gardens of Topkapi Palace, where the air smelled of citrus and secrets. Falcons soared like royal messengers with attitude. They weren't just birds. They were symbols of power, precision, and the occasional romantic misfire. And no one handled them better than Emir the falconer. Emir was tall, quiet, and perpetually covered in feathers. He had a scar across his cheek, not from battle, but from a particularly moody hawk named Sultan. He spoke little, but when he did, his words landed like arrows, sharp, direct, and oddly poetic. He was admired from afar by many, but only one dared to flirt: Sultana Layla. Layla was known for her boldness. She wore colors that defied tradition, laughed too loudly at poetry readings, and once convinced a visiting ambassador that her parrot was fluent in Latin. She had a fascination with falcons, not for their symbolism, but for their eyes. "They look like they know everything," she once said. While feeding one a sliver of lamb, her interest in Emir began innocently. She requested a tour of the aviary. Emir obliged. He introduced her to the birds, explained their training, and demonstrated how to wear a falcon on one's wrist without losing circulation. Layla was captivated, not by the birds, by him. She began visiting more often, always with a new question, always with a new outfit. Emir remained professional, but the falcons noticed. One began cooing when Layla approached. Another refused to fly unless she was watching. Then came the flirtation. Layla left a note in Emir's falconry kit. It was folded into the shape of a bird and smelled faintly of jasmine. The message read, "If I were a falcon, I'd choose your wrist." Emir found it. He didn't respond, but the next day, he sent a falcon to her chambers. It carried a ribbon, deep blue, the color of Layla's favorite caftan. They never spoke of it, but the visits continued. The glances lingered. The falcons grew smug. One evening, during a training session, Emir let Layla release a bird. It soared into the sky, circled once, and returned to her arm like it had chosen her. She smiled. He nodded. It was the closest they ever came to a confession. Then, as all palace romances do, it ended quietly. Layla was summoned to the imperial council. Her wit was needed in a diplomatic dispute involving carpets. Emir remained in the aviary, training birds and folding notes into feathers. They never met again, but sometimes Layla would wear the blue ribbon in her hair, and Emir would smile at the falcons, wondering if they still remembered her laugh, because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need words. Sometimes it just needed wings. In the echoing marble halls of Topkapi Palace, music was more than entertainment. It was a language, a coded, seductive, occasionally off-key language that carried secrets between silk curtains and moonlit balconies, and no one spoke it more fluently than Semil the lute player. Semil was a man of rhythm and romance. His fingers danced across strings like whispers on velvet. His songs could make a sultana sigh, a eunuch tear up, and a parrot repeat scandalous verses for days. He wore his heart on his sleeve, and his heartbreak in his melodies. But Semil had a problem. He was in love with Sultana Zeynep, a woman so graceful. She made shadows jealous. Zeynep was known for her quiet strength, her love of poetry, and her habit of attending musical performances with a look that said, "I'm listening, but I'm also judging your chord progression." Semil noticed and fell. He began composing songs just for her. Not openly, of course. That would be foolish. Instead, he disguised his affection in metaphor. One song spoke of a moon that refused to rise. Another told of a rose that bloomed in winter. Zeynep listened. She smiled. She never said a word. Then came the serenade. One night, under a sky so starry, it looked like the palace ceiling had sprung a leak. Semil positioned himself beneath Zeynep's balcony. He strummed his lute. He sang of longing, of velvet, of a woman whose silence was louder than thunder. It was beautiful. It was bold. It was a mistake, because Zeynep's chambers were not empty. Her aunt, Sultana Halime, was visiting. Halime was not a fan of music. She preferred silence, embroidery, and judging people from behind fans. She heard the serenade. She summoned the guards. Semil was dragged from the courtyard mid-chorus. His lute was confiscated. His dignity was bruised. His song, unfinished. Zeynep, upon hearing the commotion, descended from her chambers. She found Semil in the corridor, surrounded by guards and feathers, from a pillow he'd accidentally collided with. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Your metaphors are improving." Then she turned and walked away. Shamil was reassigned to the palace kitchens, where he played spoons and sang to the soup. His songs lost their edge, but gained flavor. Zainab continued attending performances, always with that same unreadable smile. And the lute? It was returned to Semil months later, with a single tulip tucked inside the strings. He never played it again, but he kept it close, because in Topkapi Palace, love was fleeting, music was dangerous, and sometimes the most romantic gesture was a tulip in a broken lute. In the quietest wing of Topkapi Palace, where the walls were lined with velvet and the air smelled faintly of sandalwood and secrets, there stood a mirror unlike any other. It was tall, framed in gold, and rumored to whisper. Not actual words, of course. That would be absurd. But those who gazed into it claimed to hear things. Faint murmurs, half-formed thoughts, echoes of emotions that didn't belong to them. Some said it was haunted. Others said it was enchanted. Most just said it was unsettling and avoided it during full moons. But Sultana Esma was not most people. Esma was curious. She had a mind like a maze, and a heart that beat to the rhythm of riddles. She loved puzzles, poetry, and things that didn't make sense until they suddenly did. So, naturally, she was drawn to the mirror. She began visiting it at night, when the palace was asleep and the silence was thick enough to slice. She'd sit before it, wrapped in her favorite shawl, and stare, not at her reflection, but at the space behind it, the shimmer, the suggestion of something more. And then, one night, it spoke, not in words, in feeling. Esma saw herself, but not quite. Her reflection blinked slower, smiled differently, tilted its head like it knew something she didn't. And in that moment, Esma felt watched, not by the mirror, by someone through it. She leaned closer. The glass fogged slightly, and there, in the condensation, appeared a message. "You see me because I see you." Esma gasped, not out of fear, out of recognition, because she knew who it was. Years ago, before she was a sultana, before the palace, before the politics, she had loved a boy named Harun. He was a scholar's apprentice, with ink-stained fingers and a laugh that made her forget the world. They had shared books, dreams, and one stolen kiss beneath a fig tree. Then he vanished, taken by the empire, reassigned, forgotten, until now. Esma returned to the mirror every night. Each time, the messages grew clearer. "I remember the fig tree. Your laugh still echoes. I never stopped watching." She never told anyone. Not the other sultanas. Not the eunuchs. Not even the mirror itself. But one night, she left a message of her own, written in breath, traced with a fingertip. "I see you too." The next morning, the mirror was gone, removed, replaced. No explanation. Esma never saw it again. But sometimes, in other mirrors, in the bathhouse, in her chambers, in the polished silver of a serving tray, she'd catch a glimpse of a smile that wasn't hers. And she'd smile back, because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need presents. Sometimes, it just needed a reflection. In the quiet salons of Topkapi Palace, where the scent of rosewater lingered and the sound of distant oud music hummed like a lullaby, there sat a chessboard that had seen more romance than rivalry. It was carved from ebony and ivory, polished daily by a eunuch named Ferhat, who believed the pawns deserved respect. The board had hosted sultans, viziers, and poets, but its most cunning player was Sultana Mahfiruz. Mahfiruz didn't just play chess, she performed it. She'd arrive in a swirl of silk, select her pieces like choosing allies, and move with the grace of someone who knew exactly how the game and the world worked. Her opponents rarely stood a chance, not because she was ruthless, but because she was distracting. And her favorite opponent? The palace historian, Kamal. Kamal was quiet, bookish, and perpetually surrounded by scrolls. He had a beard that looked like it had been shaped by a compass, and eyes that sparkled when discussing obscure treaties. He came to the salon for peace. He stayed for Mahfiruz. Their matches began formally. She'd nod, he'd bow. The pawns would march. But soon, the games became flirtations. Mahfiruz would move her queen with a flourish and say, "She's feeling bold today." Kamal would counter with a knight and reply, "He's protective of her." The pieces became characters. The board, a stage. Their banter, a script. One afternoon, Mahfiruz made a move so daring, so unexpected, that Kamal paused. She had sacrificed her bishop to trap his king. It was brilliant. It was reckless. It was romantic. Kamal looked up. "You risked everything." Mahfiruz smiled. "Isn't that how love works?" He didn't respond. But the next day, he brought her a scroll, a poem, written in the margins of a treaty. It spoke of queens, knights, and the danger of playing with hearts. They never kissed, never confessed, but their games continued. Each match was a conversation, each move a message. Mahfiruz began wearing a pendant shaped like a rook. Kamal started using metaphors that involved castles and checkmates. Then, one day, Mahfiruz stopped playing. She had been summoned to the Imperial Council. Her strategic mind was needed elsewhere. Kemal continued visiting the salon, setting up the board, waiting. She never returned. But the chessboard remained, and sometimes, when the light hit it just right, Ferhat swore he could see the ghost of a game, a queen in motion, a knight in pursuit, and a love story carved in ebony and ivory, because in Topkapi Palace, love wasn't always declared. Sometimes it was played in the shadowed alcoves of Topkapi Palace, where the air was thick with rosewater and rumors. Scent was more than luxury. It was language. Every sultana had her signature fragrance. Some chose jasmine for mystery. Others preferred amber for power. But one woman's scent could stop conversations mid-sip and make even the most stoic vizier blink twice. Her name was Sultana Dilruba. Dilruba was elegance distilled. She moved like mist, spoke like silk, and smelled like temptation. Her perfume was legendary, a blend of crushed violets, saffron, and something no one could quite identify. It lingered in corridors, long after she passed, like a memory that refused to fade. The secret behind her scent? A man named Nadir. Nadir was the palace perfumer. He lived in a chamber filled with vials, herbs, and scrolls of forgotten recipes. He spoke in notes, top, middle, base, and believed that every emotion had an aroma. He once claimed heartbreak smelled like burnt fig and longing like wet cedar. Dilruba was intrigued. She began visiting his workshop under the guise of fragrance consultation. She'd sit on a velvet stool, inhale deeply, and ask questions like, "What does betrayal smell like?" Or, "Can you bottle nostalgia?" Nadir answered with blends. He'd crush petals, heat oils, and swirl liquids until the room pulsed with emotion. Dilruba listened. She learned. She began mixing her own scents, subtle, seductive, and dangerously specific. Then came the potion. One evening, Dilruba asked Nadir to create a fragrance that would make someone fall in love. Not just admire, not just desire, love. Nadir hesitated. That's not perfume, he said. That's alchemy. Dilruba smiled. Then let's mix magic. They worked for weeks, testing combinations, discarding failures. One blend made people nostalgic for places they'd never been. Another caused mild dizziness and spontaneous poetry. Finally, they found it. A potion so potent it made the palace parrot recite romantic couplets in Persian. Dilruba wore it to the Sultan's banquet. She entered the hall. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The Sultan blinked. The viziers sighed. Even the soup tasted better. But Dilruba wasn't aiming for the Sultan. She glanced at Nadir, standing quietly by the doorway, holding a vial like a secret. Their eyes met. The scent swirled. And in that moment, they both knew the potion had worked. Not on others, on them. They never spoke of it, never touched, never confessed. But every time Dilruba wore that fragrance, Nadir would smile. And every time Nadir mixed a new blend, he'd add a drop of violet, just for her. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need words. Sometimes it just needed a scent. In the bustling kitchens of Topkapi Palace, where spices danced in the air and gossip simmered alongside stew, there existed a pantry so large it had its own echo. It was a place of jars, jams, and, unexpectedly, poetry. And in that pantry lived a secret. His name was Farid, and he was the palace's unofficial poet in residence. Officially, he was a spice sorter. Unofficially, he was a romantic with a quill tucked behind his ear and a heart full of metaphors. He wrote verses on parchment, napkins, and occasionally the backs of cinnamon labels. Farid had a muse. Her name was Sultana Rana. Rana was known for her sweet tooth and sharper tongue. She had a fondness for candied figs, a talent for diplomacy, and a habit of wandering into the kitchen when palace politics became too spicy. She claimed she came for the raisins. Everyone knew she came for Farid. Their first meeting was accidental. Rana had entered the pantry in search of saffron. Farid, startled, dropped a jar of cloves and a scroll of poetry. Rana picked up the scroll, read it, smiled. "Your words taste better than your spices," she said. Farid blushed so hard he nearly fainted into the nutmeg. From then on, Rana visited often. She'd ask for obscure ingredients. "Do you have dried rose petals soaked in moonlight?" And Farid would respond with a poem, sometimes about love, sometimes about longing, once about lentils. They never touched, never kissed, but their flirtation was fragrant. Farid began hiding verses in jars. Rana would find them tucked behind the turmeric, folded into the flour, nestled among the raisins. One read, "If sweetness were a person, she'd wear silk and ask for cinnamon." Rana responded with embroidered handkerchiefs, stitched lines of poetry, subtle and scented. One bore the words, "Your words linger longer than my perfume." Their affair was quiet, poetic, and pantry-bound, until one day Rana stopped visiting. She had been summoned to a diplomatic mission, a trade negotiation involving carpets and candied almonds. Farid waited. He wrote. He hid verses in jars she never opened. Then, Weeks later, a jar of saffron was returned to the kitchen. Inside was a note. The almonds were bland. I missed your spice. Farid smiled. He folded the note. He placed it in the jar labeled Hope, and every time he sorted spices, he whispered verses to the jars, just in case Rana returned. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always bloom in gardens. Sometimes it simmered in the pantry once a year, when the moon hung low and the Bosphorus shimmered like spilled silver. Topkapi Palace hosted the Lantern Festival, a night of light, longing, and quiet wishes. The sultanas would gather in the courtyard, dressed in silks that caught the breeze like sails. They carried lanterns, delicate, hand-painted, and filled with secrets. Each lantern held a wish, written on parchment, folded into the flame's glow. When released, they floated into the sky like glowing confessions. Sultana Yasmin had never participated. She claimed it was frivolous. Wishes are for poets, she'd say, while adjusting her earrings with the precision of a mathematician. But deep down, Yasmin had a wish, one she'd never spoken, one she'd buried beneath layers of logic and lace. His name was Tariq. Tariq was the palace architect, a man who saw beauty in angles, poetry in arches, and romance in symmetry. He had designed the new wing of the harem, and Yasmin had overseen its decoration. Their meetings were brief, professional, and charged with something neither could name. He once complimented her choice of tiles. She replied with a comment about load-bearing columns. It was the most romantic exchange of structural engineering in palace history. Yasmin began walking past the construction site more often. Tariq began sketching designs that subtly resembled her silhouette. They never touched, never flirted, but their blueprints told a story. Then came the festival. Yasmin arrived late, carrying a lantern she claimed was just for decoration. She stood apart from the crowd, watching as the others released their glowing wishes. The sky filled with light. The air shimmered with hope. And then she saw him. Tariq stood across the courtyard, holding a lantern. He lit it, released it, and as it rose, Yasmin saw a folded parchment flutter from its base. It landed near her feet. She picked it up, unfolded it, read the words. If I could build a bridge to your heart, I'd never need a palace. Yasmin didn't speak. She didn't cry. She simply lit her lantern, tucked a note inside, and let it rise. No one saw what she wrote, but Tariq watched the lantern float toward his and smiled. They never spoke of it, never met again. But the next morning, a new sketch appeared in the architect's chamber. A bridge, delicate and winding, leading to a garden shaped like a heart. And in the center of that garden stood a single lantern. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need words. Sometimes it just needed light. In the quiet corners of Topkapi Palace, where the tapestries whispered and the cushions held centuries of sighs, there worked a woman whose needle knew more secrets than most courtiers. Her name was Lael, the royal seamstress. Lael didn't speak much. She didn't need to. Her fingers did the talking, stitching stories into hems, weaving emotions into sleeves, and hiding confessions in the folds of caftans. She embroidered with such grace that even the sultanas paused to admire her work before plotting their next romantic misadventure. But Layla had a secret. She was in love with Sultana Mehtap. Mehtap was elegance incarnate. She wore silks like second skin, walked like poetry, and had a gaze that could unravel even the tightest stitch. She was kind, curious, and always the first to compliment Layli's embroidery, especially the subtle flourishes no one else noticed. Their connection began with thread. Mehtap once requested a robe embroidered with stars. Not just any stars, she said, the kind that know how to listen. Lale delivered a masterpiece, constellations stitched in silver, each one slightly different, each one whispering something only Mehtap could hear. From then on, Mehtap requested all her garments from Lael, and Lele quietly began stitching her heart into every hem. She hid initials in the cuffs, wove verses into the lining. Once, she embroidered a moon so delicately into a collar that Mehtap wore it for a week straight, claiming it helped her sleep. They never spoke of love, never touched, but their silence was threaded with meaning. Then came the robe. Mehtap asked for something special, a garment for the lantern festival. Make it glow, she said, but softly, like a secret. Lale worked for days. She chose midnight blue silk, stitched lanterns in gold thread, and added a single, hidden detail. Beneath the left sleeve, invisible unless lifted, she embroidered the words, "My heart is stitched to yours." Mehtap wore the robe. She glowed. She danced. She never mentioned the message, but the next morning, Lael found a note tucked into her sewing basket. It was written on silk, folded like a petal, and scented with Mehtap's perfume. Some stitches never unravel. They never spoke of it again. But every robe Mehtap wore after that had a hidden stitch, a secret only Lale knew. And in the quiet hum of the sewing room, where needles whispered and fabric sighed, Lael smiled. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need declarations. Sometimes it just needed a stitch. In the highest tower of Topkapi Palace, where the wind whispered secrets and the stars blinked like knowing eyes, lived a man who charted the heavens and accidentally fell in love. His name was Selim, the royal astronomer. Selim was a man of numbers and nebulae. He spoke in constellations, dreamed in lunar cycles, and once calculated the Sultan's birthday gift using planetary alignments. He wore robes dusted with chalk and carried a telescope like a scepter. Most thought him eccentric. Some thought him brilliant. One thought him beautiful. Sultana Aylin. Aylin was unlike the others. She didn't care for politics or poetry. She cared for silence, for sky, for things that couldn't be embroidered. She often wandered the palace at night, barefoot and curious, drawn to the stars like a moth to moonlight. One evening, she climbed the tower. She claimed she was lost. Selim, startled, dropped his star chart. Aylin picked it up. Their fingers touched. The stars blinked. From that night on, she returned. They spoke of galaxies, of gravity, of how love might be just another form of orbit. Selim showed her Saturn's rings. Aylin asked if longing had a shape. He pointed to the crescent moon and said, "That's what missing someone looks like." Their affair was quiet, celestial, and coded in constellations. Selim began naming stars after her, not officially, but in his notes. Aylin Minor, he wrote, beside a cluster that reminded him of her laugh. Aylin Major, for the one that matched her gaze. He charted her into the sky, one twinkle at a time. Then came the eclipse. Aylin was betrothed, not by choice, but by decree. Her marriage was to secure an alliance, a union of empires. She visited Selim one last time, wrapped in silk and sorrow. "I'll be gone by morning," she said. Selim didn't speak. He simply handed her a scroll, a map of the stars. with one constellation circled in gold. This one only appears once a year, he said. When it does, look up. I'll be looking too. They never met again. But every year, on the night of that constellation's return, Aylin would climb her new palace's tower, gaze at the sky, and whisper his name. And in Topkapi, Selim would do the same. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always stay grounded. Sometimes it lived among the stars, in the record rooms of Topkapi Palace, where scrolls slept in silence and ink dried with dignity. There worked a man whose handwriting was so beautiful it was considered mildly scandalous. His name was Horace, the royal scribe. Horace was a master of script. His letters curled like flirtation, his margins whispered secrets, and his punctuation had more personality than most courtiers. He could transcribe a treaty and make it read like a love poem. He could copy a decree and make it sound like a confession. Naturally, this made him dangerous, especially to Sultana Faride. Faride was sharp, skeptical, and famously unimpressed by flattery. She preferred facts over flowers, logic over lace, and once corrected a vizier's grammar mid-sentence. But even she couldn't resist Harris's handwriting. Their first encounter was bureaucratic. Faride had requested a copy of a land grant. Harris delivered it, flawlessly penned, with a flourish at the end that looked suspiciously like a heart. Faride raised an eyebrow. Is this standard formatting? Harris smiled. Only for exceptional recipients. She didn't respond, but she requested more documents. Soon, Faride was asking for transcriptions of everything. Old poems, forgotten laws, even the palace's inventory of spoons. Harris obliged, each time adding a subtle twist, a metaphor in the margins, a compliment disguised as a footnote, a comma that lingered like a sigh. Then came the slippery script. One day, Faride received a scroll. It was a copy of a diplomatic letter, but the ink shimmered oddly. She tilted the parchment. Hidden between the lines, written in lemon juice, was a message. If words could touch, I'd write you into my arms. Faride didn't react. She simply sent back a scroll of her own, a list of palace expenditures, with one item circled, ink, scented. Harris understood. Their affair unfolded in footnotes. They never met in secret, never exchanged gifts, but their correspondence grew increasingly poetic. Faride began using metaphors in her memos. Horace began signing his name with a flourish that resembled her initials. Then, one day, Faride stopped writing. She had been appointed to oversee a distant province. A promotion, a departure, a silence. Horace continued scribing, but every now and then, he'd slip a line into a treaty, a flourish into a decree, a sigh into a sentence. And in her new palace, Faride would receive official documents, all perfectly penned, all suspiciously familiar. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always need meetings. Sometimes it just needed margins. In the oldest wing of Topkapi Palace, where the stones were worn smooth by centuries of secrets and the air held the hush of forgotten sighs, there stood a corridor no one liked to walk alone. The walls whispered, not loudly, not clearly, but just enough to make the hairs on your neck rise and your footsteps falter. Some said it was the wind. Others blamed the acoustics. But the Sultanas knew better. The walls remembered. Sultana Zara had always been drawn to silence. She preferred moonlight to candlelight, solitude to salons, and once spent an entire banquet sketching the shadows on her napkin. She was thoughtful, quiet, and curious, especially about the corridor. She began walking it at dusk, when the palace grew still and the whispers grew bold. At first, she heard nothing. Then, faintly, she began to catch fragments. The rose garden. He waited. Never told her. Zara listened. She leaned against the stone. She traced the cracks like veins. And slowly, she pieced together a story. It was a love affair. Long buried, never spoken, etched into the very bones of the palace. A sultana named Layli, a guard named Murad. They had met in secret, exchanged notes hidden in lanterns, and once carved their initials into the wall behind the tapestry of the phoenix. Their love was quiet, fierce, and doomed. Murad was reassigned. Layli was married off. But the walls remembered. Zara found the initials. Faded, but there. She touched them. The whisper grew louder. She waited by the fountain. Zara followed the voice. It led her to the old garden, overgrown and forgotten. There, beneath a crumbling arch, she found a stone bench, and beneath it, a box. Inside, a letter. Unsent, unopened, unfinished. If you ever hear the walls speak, know they speak of you. Zara didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply folded the letter, placed it back in the box, and whispered, "They still do." From that night on, she walked the corridor with reverence. She added her own whispers, stories of her dreams, her fears, her quiet hopes. And the walls, ever loyal, listened, because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always live in hearts. Sometimes it lived in stone. The palace theater was rarely used. Tucked behind the eastern wing, its velvet seats gathered dust, and its stage held echoes of long-forgotten performances. Once, it had hosted grand dramas and musical recitals. Now, it was a sanctuary for silence and for one final love story. Sultana Nigar had always loved the theater. She wasn't a performer, but a watcher, a quiet soul who found comfort in stories that weren't hers. She'd slip into the back row during rehearsals, hidden behind a fan, letting the actors' emotions wash over her like warm rain. And then came Arman. Arman was the palace playwright. He had ink-stained cuffs, a voice like velvet, and a habit of writing tragedies that ended too soon. He noticed Nigar during a rehearsal. Her stillness, her gaze, the way she leaned forward during the quiet parts. He wrote a play for her, not openly, not officially, but every line, every pause, every sigh was hers. The heroine wore her favorite shade of blue. The hero quoted her favorite poet. The final scene took place in a garden that mirrored the one she walked each morning. Nigar knew. She said nothing. Instead, she began leaving notes in the theater, tucked beneath cushions, slipped behind curtains. Short lines, half-thoughts. One read, "Your words linger longer than my silence." Arman found them. He replied, in dialogue, in monologue, in the way the actors paused before speaking. Their affair unfolded in shadows and scripts, never spoken aloud, never acknowledged. Then came the final curtain. The Sultan announced a renovation. The theater would be repurposed, turned into a council chamber. The velvet would be stripped, the stage dismantled. Arman wrote one last play. It was short, quiet, a single scene. A woman sits alone in an empty theater. She reads a letter. She smiles. She leaves. He left the script on Nigar's seat. She read it. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply folded the pages, placed them in her sleeve, and walked out. just as the workers arrived. The theater was transformed. The stage was gone, but sometimes, when the council met and the room fell silent, someone would swear they heard a whisper, a line from a play that was never performed. Because in Topkapi Palace, love didn't always take a bow. Sometimes, it slipped quietly behind the curtain. Topkapi Palace had always been a place of whispers. They floated through the halls like perfume, curled beneath cushions, and tucked themselves into folds of silk. But there was one whisper that never made it into scrolls or songs. The one about the storyteller. Her name was Huri. She wasn't a sultana, nor a concubine, nor a servant. She was the palace dreamkeeper, a woman tasked with recording the dreams of the royal household. Each morning, she'd collect murmurs from half-asleep sultanas, scribble down fragments of longing, and file them away in a chamber no one else entered. But Huri had a secret. She didn't just record dreams. She embroidered them into stories. Every tale of forbidden love, every stolen glance, every tulip-coated rendezvous, they were hers. She stitched them into parchment, folded them into poetry, and tucked them into the corners of the palace like lullabies. No one knew, until one night, a young sultana named Lale wandered into the dreamkeeper's chamber. She had trouble sleeping. She asked for a story. Huri hesitated. Then she opened a drawer, pulled out a scroll, and began to read. It was the tale of a seamstress who stitched her heart into a hem. Lale listened. She smiled. She slept. Word spread. Soon, sultanas began visiting Huri, not for dream records, but for bedtime stories. She'd read of falconers and perfumers, of scribes and astronomers, of lanterns and letters, and love that never quite said its name. And each night, as the palace drifted into sleep, Huri whispered one final truth. These stories are yours. You lived them. You dreamed them. You loved them. Quietly, fiercely, beautifully. No one ever asked how she knew. They just listened and slept. Because in Topkapi Palace, the truth wasn't loud. It was sleepy. It was soft. It was stitched into stories and tucked beneath pillows. And now, dear reader, you've heard them too. So close your eyes. Let the tulips bloom. Let the lanterns rise. Let the whispers settle and sleep, knowing that somewhere in the folds of history, love was embroidered into every sigh. Good night.